Ever since elementary school, I struggled with studying, and as a middle schooler, I wanted to graduate as soon as possible. I decided early on that I wouldn't go to high school. I couldn't see any meaning in studying at school, except for technology, home economics, art, physical education, and of course, lunchtime. It was incredibly painful trying to pass the time enduring doing things that I didn't want to. I wanted to get into the world as soon as possible and learn skills. My name, Mason, was given to me by my father, who was a master carpenter. He named me for the reason, if you're skilled with your hands, you'll never go hungry in life. I heard this from my mother. I had never asked my father how I got this name. He passed away from cancer when I was in the 2nd grade of elementary school. However, I must say, the saying the name reflects the person is quite accurate. I've been good with my hands since I was little. It was so much fun to see things in my hands change shape as I work on. My mother would comment on the chairs, bookshelves, and containers I brought home that I crafted during technology classes in middle school.
You're the spitting image of your father.
I don't know what she meant by that, but to me, it was the highest compliment. It made me feel like I was truly the child of my amazing father. After graduating from middle school, I got a job at a small factory that made various machine parts, assembled large equipment and small devices. There were about 20 employees, including part-timers. My co-workers ranged in age from their 20s to 50s, with the oldest being a 35-year veteran in the field, Mr. Brown. He held the title of factory manager, but he'd say, "That is too formal for me," and let everyone call him by a nickname based on part of his last name. He was rough around the edges, the epitome of a craftsman. I was also bewildered by Mr. Brown's coarse way of speaking when I first joined the company. But Mr. Brown had an endearing gap between his appearance and his true nature. As his name suggests, he was as big as a bear, but his work was fast and more detailed than any others. Plus, he always had a smile on his face, so everyone loved him. Everyone was kind to me, who had just graduated from a middle school a few months ago, except for the head of the General Affairs Department, Mr. Johnson. He became a department head despite having only worked at the factory for about a year because our president went out of his way to bring him on board. I heard that Mr. Johnson was a former banker and a high school classmate of our president. The president thought the company needed financial help and approached Mr. Johnson to join. He was just lucky to be picked up by our president after dropping out of the race for promotions at the bank. There were rumors like that in the company, but I didn't know the truth. The problem was that the president had been hospitalized to treat a bad back before a month I joined the company. When I joined, Mr. Johnson was effectively the top of the company.
"I have been entrusted with full authority by the president."
Mr. Johnson would say this at every opportunity. From the start, Mr. Johnson had it in for me. I didn't know what the direct reason was. I wasn't polite enough to my seniors. My work was slow. I was rough in handling the products. No matter how careful I was, Mr. Johnson's nagging at me never changed. One day, I was called into his office. There was an error in the document I submitted. Maybe it was because a mistake that could have been easily noticed if I had been more careful. Mr. Johnson attacked me more persistently than ever before. The people around the office looked at me with pity, but said nothing. They probably didn't want Mr. Johnson's anger to spill onto them. Just when I thought it was longer than usual.
"I can't take an employee like you to our next company trip, who contributes very little to the company. We can't completely leave the company empty, so it's perfect. Stay behind and watch over the place. I'll tell the president that it's your decision not to go. Got it?"
Mr. Johnson spoke all at once. Our company had a tradition of going on a hot spring trip for relaxation during the last weekend of the fiscal month. The company covered all the costs. Although it was only for a night, I heard that we would stay at a famous luxury inn in the local area and have a big party at night. As the company trip approached, the employees' excitement grew. My expectations grew as I listened to stories from last year's trip from the people around me. It would be my first time, and I had never stayed at a luxury inn before, so I was even more excited. But the fact that I was the only one left behind made me feel frustrated and angry. However, I couldn't go against my boss's orders. I decided that I had no choice but to follow what Mr. Johnson said. The next day, before work started, Mr. Brown returned from the office and approached me with long strides. I could tell he was angry even from a distance, though he was usually gentle.
"What's going on?"
He asked me abruptly. I didn't understand what Mr. Brown meant. Seeing my confusion, Mr. Brown asked me again, still with an angry expression.
"What's this about you staying behind during the company trip?"
He must have heard about the company trip incident from someone when he went to the office. I hesitated whether I should explain the situation to Mr. Brown or not. Then Mr. Brown said,
"I've been thinking for a while that his attitude towards you is too harsh. I can't hold back any more this time. I'll say a word to that guy."
It wasn't imaginable for the usually gentle Mr. Brown to call Mr. Johnson that guy.
"Wait here. I'll go and settle this,"
he said, turning his back to me. "Mr. Brown, wait," I called out to him. "I appreciate your thought, but I don't want to make a big deal out of it. I'll take good care of the company while everyone's gone, so don't worry." At that moment, I tried my best to smile, but I wonder how it looked to Mr. Brown. He stared at my face intently.
"All right,"
he said, still seeming to want to say something more but heading to his workstation instead. A few days later, on the day of the company trip, I went to work as usual. I opened all the shutters in the factory and office and turned on the office lights. It was my first time preparing for the start of the day alone since joining the company. As I prepared, I thought back to my first day at work. That day, I arrived at the office early to prepare for the start of the workday. I didn't have a key, but I planned to prepare with the first person who arrived at the office.
My dad used to do this when he was a newbie. Why don't you try it too?
It was my mom's advice. The first person to show up at the office was a large, intimidating manual. It was Mr. Brown. "Good morning," I greeted. The man smiled and replied,
"You're the new guy, huh? Nice to meet you."
It was the first time I heard Mr. Brown's casual way of speaking. I was a bit surprised, but seeing Mr. Brown's expression, my morning tension quickly eased. From then on, it became my daily routine to prepare for the start of the workday with Mr. Brown. The reason I continued to arrive earlier than other employees, even after joining the company, was because the time I spent with Mr. Brown was precious. Mr. Brown patiently taught me not only the attitude towards work, but also the feelings about product making and technical tips. However, I could only have a deep conversation with Mr. Brown for a few minutes in the morning. Once another employee arrived, my interaction with Mr. Brown ended.
"We have to treat everyone equally. Well, it's the fate of someone with a title,"
Mr. Brown once explained to me. I become quite fond of Mr. Brown, who was attentive to every people. I was also happy to have someone I wanted to look up to nearby. The reason I remembered my first day at work while alone in the company was that I had too much time on my hands. Since everyone was on the company trip, there was no reason to operate the machines just because the factory was open. The only thing I could do was to be on phone duty, just as Mr. Johnson had told me. Still, there were only 2 or 3 calls per hour, and I was bored most of the time. After I had lunch, it started raining heavily sometime. I remembered the weather forecast I saw that morning, which said it would rain in the afternoon. How unusual for it to be so accurate. The weather reporter on the program I watched had a unique forecast but often got it wrong, so he was often teased by the host. Moreover, it was sunny that morning. As usual, the host had criticized the weather forecaster's prediction on the show. I didn't think the weather would turn so bad either. Listening to the sound of the rain, I realized something. The cardboard boxes for the big contract products had been delivered yesterday. The problem was where they were placed. Since the warehouse was full due to the last-minute contract, they were temporarily placed outside. Though there was an overhang, it was obvious that the cardboard boxes would be ruined by such heavy rain. I suddenly felt a rush of panic, and I ran to the warehouse. I remembered there were blue tarps. I thought if I could cover everything, it would prevent them from getting wet. But the tarps were much heavier than I thought. I could only carry 2 at a time. I put the tarps over the boxes, but it was difficult to do it alone, and the rain kept pouring. Why is this happening? I continued working, feeling like I might cry. That's when it happened.
I'll help you.
I heard a voice from behind. Who are you? There's no time for such leisurely questions. The priority is to cover the boxes with tarps. I continued the task with the stranger who suddenly appeared. As soon as there were 2 of us, the work efficiency improved dramatically. We managed to cover all the boxes with tarps.
Do you think we minimized the damage?
The man, about 30 years old, asked me. Oh, thank you so much. I bowed deeply.
No need for thanks. I'll just have my father, the boss, show his gratitude later.
The man laughed as he spoke. I felt like I had seen his smiling face somewhere before, but I couldn't quite remember. More importantly, we needed to get out of the heavy rain. I invited the man into the office. I handed him a towel I found luckily in the office to dry his hair. My body was chilled from working in the rain. He must have felt the same way. I turned on the heater. We both stripped down to our underwear and hung our clothes on chairs to dry. I made a cup of coffee and handed it to the manual.
I am Patrick Martin. My father, the president, is always grateful for your help.
Was it the bond of being half naked? The man suddenly lost his formality, probably because we were both in our underwear. And I finally understood why I thought I recognized someone I had just met. Martin is the president's last name. I remembered that the president's only son, who was studying in the UK for an MBA, would be returning soon. Apparently, he came to the factory right after returning to the country. Patrick had heard from the president that it was the day of the company trip. Yet the office light was on, and when he peeked inside, no one was there. Then he saw someone running towards the factory. Feeling curious, he went outside and saw me working in the rain, drenched, so he called out to me.
By the way, why are you here today?
Patrick asked me. I hesitated to tell him the truth. He must have sensed my hesitation from my expression. Patrick said,
My father, the president, heard about your situation from Mr. Brown. He was worried about you and asked me to help when I returned.
That's when I found out Mr. Brown was actually a high school classmate of the president and Mr. Johnson. It made sense why he was angry about me not being able to go on the company trip and called Mr. Johnson that guy. I couldn't tell if what Patrick said about the president being worried about me was true. Would the president really talk about me to Patrick, who was overseas? Maybe Patrick was just trying to get information from me. But his words made me want to tell him the truth.
I see.
Patrick looked serious after hearing my story.
That is definitely workplace harassment. If this gets out, it'll be bad for our company. We can't let this go.
Patrick said quietly. A few days later, the president was discharged from the hospital, and I was called into his office.
I'm sorry.
As soon as the president saw me, he apologized. I was surprised by his sudden words, and he continued.
It's all my responsibility.
I thought he must have heard what I told Patrick that day. After that, Mr. Johnson, who had been harassing me, was demoted to a regular employee. He wasn't fired because he showed deep remorse, and his financial knowledge was unparalleled in the company, making him a necessary person for internal reforms. According to the president, the role of a leader is not to fire people easily but to nurture them, the president said. But I don't know if this personnel change was good for me, because Mr. Johnson started asking me about work procedures and know-how a lot. It seems Mr. Brown told him to ask me if he had any questions. Used to be called you, now it's Mr. after punishment. I thought it was too much, so I asked for at least buddy. I hope my awkward relationship with Mr. Johnson ends soon, but for now, I'm relieved to work with people I love and enjoy my job.